In Japanese, for example, you basically have the possibility of 80,000 Chinese characters, but let's say you're just dealing with about 6,000 most common ones you're trying to set. So you've got to keep those 6,000, and then you've got to keep your local 100 or so local characters, which are like alphabetic characters, which you sprinkle these all together, mix them all together and make words out of them. Now, how many variants would you need? You have your 26 letters of the alphabet, but you have different sizes and you have different types of font, don't you?
That's right. So what we would have in a font is obviously different sizes, 6 point, 8 point, 10 point, 12 point, but that would only be of one typeface. If you wanted an italic of that, then again you would have to have 6, 8, 10, 12 of the italic, and the same with bold and so on. And of course this is what makes the case room so large, because of course you have to multiply your cases. And again, this is the advantage of the computer of today, where again we speak about having 6, 8, 10, but again we can change it over quite easily by pressing a button on the computer.
But here, supposing you had 6 different sizes and 3 different kinds of font, italic and so on, that's 18 different sets you've got to keep of the 26 characters. Now, if you had, say, 6,000 characters times 18, it wouldn't fit in this room at all. No way it would fit in this room. Imagine you were in charge of a Japanese newspaper at the end of the 19th century when they tried to use movable type before computers. How long do you think it would take you, given that you have, say, 18 times 6,000 characters to set from? And how would you set about doing it?
I think you would need a lot of manpower.
Yes.
And I think, in a way, it would be quite impossible, or, you know,
do you know
especially for a daily newspaper.
Do you know how they did it? I'll relive a Japanese newspaper firm at the end of the 19th century. They'd be standing here, and little boys from Innerleithen who you'd hired would come in, and you'd say, right, today you're going to try and find, out of the 50, 100,000 characters around this place, you're going to try and do one page. And this is the page you've got to do, and you show them a copy of it. They would then memorize it, more or less, and start singing it aloud, or reciting it aloud so they could keep remembering it, what they were looking for. And then they would head off, you know, a whole gang of them in all different directions, each with a page in their hand, mumbling aloud what they were looking for. And each Chinese character starts with what's known as a radical or a root, which tells you the category of the picture, which is the Chinese character. So it would have water character. You're looking for pond, it would say water, and then the rest of it would say subdivision pond. So you'd head off for a case which had about, you know, 1,000 characters in it, or 2,000 characters. You'd try and find among those the pond character, and with a sigh of relief you'd put it into your hand, and then gradually you'd fill up a page, and after a long time, a lot of effort, you'd come back and hand it over. That's how they did it. You imagine the labour and the strain of that. So having an alphabetic system like ours is a tremendous advantage. Having a wonderful printing system like ours is a tremendous advantage. And among the other effects, which one tends to forget, is how it must have increased the precision, reliability, and the uniformity of knowledge in the West. And it's one of the great puzzles why the West had a scientific revolution, why China and Japan, which were much more advanced technologically and much greater societies at the beginning of this period, if you'd taken just before Gutenberg, just before 1450, you'd have said, well, that's where there's going to be a scientific revolution. 200 years later, you have Galileo, Newton, and so on. And many people have thought there is some connection again with printing. Now, the connections they've suggested include that in order to advance in knowledge, you have to accumulate knowledge. You have to keep a lot of knowledge at hand, and printing and books make libraries much easier and smaller. You've got to be able to change information. You've got to begin to move into a world where facts and information are not set. The Chinese often had a backward-looking view because they'd first printed the Confucian classics, and they went on printing Confucian and Buddhist texts mostly. That was most of the printing. Whereas the West had an idea, expanding knowledge, of doubt, of adding to it. Ah, a new book has come out. Ah, they've changed the preface. It's not as we thought it was. They're printing books there about this. Comparing over time between places, new editions, gave the idea of an open frontier of knowledge. So that, as well as the cumulative aspects of it, and the ease with which, as you said, you can transmit information between knowledge centres, all these things led to a kind of interest in ideas and the possibility of exploring, which was rather closed off, very difficult in China and Japan. So I think there is something in the idea that the scientific revolution is dependent. I mean, as we've said, it doesn't necessarily cause a scientific revolution because it could have just been controlled, but in the particular environment it was a necessary, if not sufficient, cause of it. Without it, it's difficult to see how you could have had a scientific revolution.
And of course, with all the movable type, this is where all your reprints could come in. Because of course, with more knowledge or something was wrong in the first edition, you could correct it or alter it and keep bringing it up to date. And of course, as I say, letterpress used to be ideal for this method of book printing. Then of course you would probably have your wider knowledge, for example your encyclopedias.
Yes, exactly.
Rather expensive, but at the same time knowledge for the masses.
Encyclopedias are terribly important. Dictionaries, encyclopedias, which are not only made possible by this, but it's much easier to use them. One of the great problems, Chinese encyclopedias, you never knew where to look because it's not alphabetic, so there was no ordering. So if you suddenly thought, I'd like to read an article on ponds, you wouldn't know which part of the encyclopedia, and so they were more or less very difficult to use, Chinese encyclopedias, whereas Western ones you just look alphabetically through and you can find that. So encyclopedias are very, very important. In fact, this area is one of the great areas for the discovery of encyclopedias. As you probably know, just down the road, Robert Chambers of the famous Chambers Encyclopedia was born in the next town from here. And his interest came from going up into the attic of his house in Peebles, where he was born, finding Encyclopedia Britannica, and he had a photographic memory. So later on in his life, he printed encyclopedias and guides and information for the people and all this scientific information. And that was revolutionized thought and knowledge in 19th century Scotland. So that was very important. The other thing is the mass of printing. I mean, I was very surprised to learn that by 1600, 2,000 new titles a year were being printed in Europe. That's a lot of new books every year, isn't it? And by 1800, it was 20,000. 20,000 new books a year. I mean, now in England there are 100,000 new books a year, but we're a bit overwhelmed with that. But 20,000 is pretty good, isn't it?
Yes.
And then new books, new knowledge, new things to discover. So you stand here in a kind of dynamite of the mind, gunpowder of the mind place, an extraordinarily seminal influence on the whole of what has developed in Western civilization. So be careful with it. Thank you very much indeed.
Pleasure. Nice meeting you.
Nice to talk.
Yeah, there's one question I'd like to ask you, Alan, is that, we've heard of the Luddite movement where the machinery was actually attacked in textiles and so on. How did that never actually happen in printing?
Yes, you might have thought of it looking backwards now. I think there's several things. Firstly, it wasn't such a great transformation at the beginning. As you know, at the beginning, Gutenberg just sort of secretly set up a little press and it didn't make much money, and it was just a tiny thing. It wasn't as if a whole vast industry suddenly arrived. So probably no one really noticed or thought about the implications of it. The second is, I think that if there had been a constant demand for written material, then people would have been put out of work. But in this case, the new technology generated a new market and a new demand. So I expect the copyists went on copying. There was still demand for parchment copying, and it went on for a longish time. But there was an added demand for printed books, so it didn't suddenly throw lots of copyists out of work. It just made more work for new people. Yeah. The third thing is that what we tend to think of printing as suddenly generating this demand for books and so on. But if you look at the production of paper, which was quite a recent innovation in Europe, and without paper you couldn't have had printing, so you had this previous 13th century introduction of Western paper. But the use of paper in the West went shooting upwards about 50 years before printing came in the beginning of the 15th century. So there was clearly a great demand for written things, and printing really had to be invented, so to speak, to satiate this demand. So that the copyists were probably not in a great worry. They were copying as hard as they could, and they thought, ah, someone's invented something which will help us. So they were quite relieved. I mean, this is fantasizing, but I think there were a number of things which made it different from the spinning and weaving revolution, which did lead exactly. But of course, as I said, it wasn't without opponents. The people who didn't like it were the powers that be, the people who controlled the mental world, the clergy and so on, were naturally, and the politicians were naturally suspicious, and in many civilizations they managed to ban it or control it. In the West they couldn't do so. When it was banned in Germany, the printers went elsewhere, and it was too late. It just went from place to place. As with many technologies, it went overseas, and that's how spinning and weaving developed too. It was banned in Germany. The mechanization occurred first in Holland and Germany, but they went to England or Flanders or somewhere else. So the same thing happened with printing. But they were rightly worried, because what you're placing in the hands of a person once they have a book is something devastating. It's a knowledge machine. It's a new open university, if you like. I mean, it just suddenly opens the world to people. Anyone can dispute with anyone. Ah, you say this, but look, I've read it in the book. It says the opposite. You're just no good. So, as you were saying, democratization, it democratizes knowledge. So everyone is level and equal. So the modern equality that we have, particularly in Scotland, as that everyone is equal and what you say is equally valid to what I say, that was enabled by books. And most civilizations don't like that. They've spent thousands of years developing a hierarchy where the top 1% know everything and the rest are illiterate and know nothing. And it's not very pleasant suddenly to discover someone coming up with a book and saying you're wrong. So that is the knowledge machine that the book is. All those facts, all those interpretations, all locked into a little space. That must have been quite tremendously important in its effects. And it carries so much information. One kind of information it carried, which again had a dramatic effect on scientific knowledge in the West, was knowledge of other ways of doing things and other civilizations. There was an enormous curiosity in Europe. One of its distinctive features, as well as its warlike nature, its competitiveness, was its curiosity. It always wanted to know about what was happening on the edges. And so, as after Columbus and after the explorations, people went tiptoeing, often not tiptoeing, gallivanting around the globe, stamping around, but they often went with notebooks or the equivalent, wrote down things and came back, and you got these travelers' accounts and botanists' accounts. All this fast flow of new knowledge came into Europe, and it came up the rivers and into the ports, and it's no accident that many of the greatest philosophers lived on ports. Adam Smith lived Kirkcaldy, and then in Glasgow. Montesquieu lived in Bordeaux, because all this new information was coming in, and they began to compare things. They said, oh, well, we've been always doing it like this, but now let's do it like that. The Chinese do it like that. What about that food stuff? What about that way of dressing? What about verandas? All the things we got from India. So all this came in and was put into books, and then people all over Europe read about it. This was very different from what happened in China, Japan, Islam. The Japanese were interested, but they shut themselves off. The Chinese really weren't very interested. China was the world. What happened elsewhere was rather irrelevant. Islam was, on the whole, not very interested. So while the West was absorbing the knowledge of all the civilizations of the world, other civilizations were either closing themselves off or not very interested. And the real tool that allowed this was the book. Without it, you couldn't have brought it back and you couldn't have disseminated it. So that's another very important role of books.